Right. Hey everybody, welcome to another fisheries industry conversations. Of course, what we do here is we educate and create awareness for the fishing industry in South Africa. I just felt the need that there is such an interesting story for South Africa and the fishing industry. So I just wanted to speak to the experts. I wanted to speak to the stakeholders and speak to people in fishing and just educate those that don't know much about fishing and those that are in fishing to be educated a bit more. Just interesting also, South Africa, I read it today, South Africa's got a value of the fishing sector is 6 billion rand per annum, and it employs just under 30,000. So it's quite a substantial sector in South Africa. It flies a bit under the radar, but it is important in terms of food security, job creation, and especially in areas where there's not so much employment along the coast, the West Coast. So that's why we're having this conversation. And one of those experts that I want to tap into his brain a bit, his name is Shaheen Moola. He's an attorney. He's got his own consultancy firm, Feike consultancy firm. He's been in the fishing industry since 2005. He's been a special legal advisor for the minister responsible for fisheries. So, Mr. Moola, good evening and thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Miles.
Just tell me, what is a special legal advisor? What's a legal advisor and what's a special legal advisor?
Just because of the nature of the employment, it's under the Public Service Administration Act at the time. I don't know if they have them anymore, but when I was Valli Moosa's legal advisor, special legal advisor, it was considered a special appointment because your job was directly associated with the minister, and that is why when he decided he no longer wished to serve as a minister post the 2004 national elections, special legal advisors become jobless and unemployed.
Yeah. So Shaheen, tell me just quickly your journey in fishing. I mean, I'm not sure everybody wakes up in the morning and decides to be a special legal advisor for the fishing industry and also want to be fisheries management and compliance. So what's your journey into fishing?
Well, it was completely fortuitous, and that is I specialized in environmental law as a junior lawyer at a firm in Johannesburg called Bowman Gilfillan. It's now just Bowman's. When I left varsity, and I got a call when I worked there from a team led by Professor Halton Cheadle, and that team was appointed by the newly appointed Minister of Environmental Affairs and Tourism, Valli Moosa, to essentially clean up the rot and corruption at the old sea fisheries branch, which was then newly renamed Marine and Coastal Management. And I essentially joined the team as a junior lawyer and became completely immersed in it. I remember looking at my diary notes for that period, and I think between 2000 and 2002, I took a day's leave, and that was a Sunday. In one of the years. So I became completely immersed in terms of fixing fisheries. We had a very small, very impressive team of administrators and lawyers that worked feverishly to fix the state of marine and coastal management back then and ready ourselves for the 2001 rights allocation process, which was going to be the first ever multi-year allocation process. And if you remember, it was then for 4 years, except for abalone, which was a 2-year quota. And so, Valli and I became good friends because we worked so close together. He was a real hands-on minister, completely immersed himself in the subject matter. I also then was asked to not only assist with fisheries, to then draft what was later to become known as the 4x4 regulations, the regulations controlling vehicle use in the coastal zone. And then we also began the initial drafts of the Coastal Management Bill, which we now know to fall under NEMA as the Coastal Management Zone Act, which Cormac Cullinan and his team finished off in subsequent years. So it all just was fortuitous. I was a junior Joburg lawyer who was asked to become involved in quota allocations and administrative law processes, and then became completely immersed in it. And fortunately, both Valli and I liked cycling, and we would essentially ride from his flat in Greenpoint on many occasions up to Oudekraal, and that was our morning meeting and discussion as to what he expected and what he wished to have play out, whether for the week or for the day. And yeah, we hit it off, and I became his legal advisor. And then subsequently, when he left government, I was appointed to head up fisheries management and compliance and aquaculture. In those days, you had one chief director running all of those. And then, of course, after I left, they appointed 3 separate chief directors. And so the staff costs went up quite a lot. But of course, working time reduced.
Yeah. Tell me, Shaheen, so I see you left just before 2005. So that means did you leave just before the 2005 allocations, or were you part of that process?
Yeah, so we set everything up. Not very many people know it, but because I was the head of fisheries and I was a lawyer, I ended up writing the general fisheries policy of 2005 while sitting in a middle seat on a flight from Heathrow to Vancouver to attend the World Fisheries Congress of 2004. It was a very productive flight. I think taxpayers earned their money for that economy class seat. I resigned together with Horse Kleinschmidt, who was the DDG. We resigned on the same day, in the same few minutes after we were both accused of being anti-transformation and racists. Because we questioned certain appointments and refused to appoint people solely on the basis of skin color. But the minister then at the time, Martinus van Schalkwyk, then begrudgingly had to accept our joint resignation, but then appointed us for a year's contract to see through the 2005 rights allocation process, which we did as members of the Fishing Rights Advisory Team, I think it was called. So we essentially, although we had resigned, we were then brought back under a special contract approved by the Minister of Finance at the time, Trevor Manuel. Then we saw through the 2005 rights allocation process and made sure that it was properly implemented and carried through. Yes.
So, I mean, if I touch on the FRAP process quickly, you drafting the 2005 rights allocation policy, right? And looking at 2015 rights allocation process, big differences, still in line with what you thought it's going to be on your flight between Vancouver and Heathrow?
Well, I think there's no denying that the various management balls were dropped. Many of the issues and principles and objectives we put in place with not only the general fisheries policy, but remember that every one of the 22 commercial fisheries that were allocated in 2005 were regulated in terms of separate sector policies with their own sets of objectives and management needs and various long-term management principles. Very few of those, if any, were implemented. For me, one of the greatest drop balls was the failure to restructure the horse mackerel industry. So today we still have the same management ethos and principles and monopolistic tendencies that we had in '05. And, the whole intention, of course, was that you wouldn't continue with these things. And now we've just allocated not now, but in 2016, we allocated another 15-year set of rights in the horse mackerel fishery without fundamentally changing its structure. It's a fishery dominated by a single vessel, and every one of those new entrants that were allocated rights are essentially reduced to being paper quotas, and they'll never amount to much. So, a lot of those objectives about the substantive transformation and empowerment of all right holders, new entrants, as well as existing operators that were on the smaller side in the bigger fisheries, never materialized. And of course, I think you're forgetting the catastrophic allocation process of 2013. I mean, that was just appalling, and showed what happens when allocation processes are governed by corruption, maladministration, people who don't understand fisheries and fishery sectors in particular. The other issue that I've been quite vocal about, of course, with 2016 as well, was that we continue this, very generic, non-specific policy process, where you've got essentially one policy, or albeit with a different title on the front page, but it's essentially one policy, one set of criteria, very vague, very generic, that governs these very different, very specialized fishing sectors. You can't, for example, have the same policy criteria and rules and objectives governing abalone as you have for Hake trawl, for example. It's just ludicrous. And you're going to set up right holders, the sector, and its future management for failure.
Yeah, and I mean, you touched on it, and it's one of the topics I wanted to speak to you about is the whole, it's almost like that whole the whole concept of a paper quota holder, to the extent that and I mean, when I started this consultancy, I didn't ever think I would want a Twitter page, but I purely just had a Twitter page to follow you because you're very vocal about issues, and I've learned a lot from what you've said, like research. And one of the conversations I saw you have is just around the paper quota holder, that it's very difficult to get rid of the paper quota holder if they don't have enough quota to run an economical, a business. So what do you do with a new rights holder and you give them too little quota? How do they get involved in fishing with very little quota instead of becoming a paper quota holder?
Well, I mean, this concept of paper quota holders, I mean, we I remember spending hours in brainstorming sessions with sector experts back in 2005, and we did it again in 2015, when I was asked by Minister Zokwana to fix the calamitous process he inherited from Juma Peterson. And I did it again when Sipakazi, as the DDG, then asked me to assist in advising on the 2016 process. It's an ongoing and very difficult issue to grapple with. Not only is it a difficult concept to understand practically, but of course, what a paper quota is differs from sector to sector. And lots of people will speak about a minimum viable quota, and I mean, I don't believe in such a thing. There is no such thing. I think I mentioned it in some of our conversations on Twitter earlier in the week about Hake deep sea trawl. You've got one of the smallest quota holders in the sector, Dye Island Fisheries, and they operate their own Hake deep sea trawl vessel, whereas people with 3-4 times the size of the quota can't. And that's only because of different rules of business that someone may apply. You could have somebody with 1,000 tons of hake deep sea trawl, but if they are more interested in spending their monies on fancy offices and fancy Porsches, well, then they're never going to have enough actually income from that quota to earn and fund a vessel or investment in processing, etc. So what constitutes enough in a fishery is almost impossible to defend or justify or grapple with practically. But I think what we have to understand is what at what levels we should introduce new entrants during a quota allocation process. What are conceivably the minimums that may be allotted to a right holder in a specific sector? Because again, what is a paper quota in one sector may not be in another, and we need to grapple with it and understand it differently. Because somebody may be a paper quota holder in theory in one sector, but not in another. I mean, Patagonian tooth fishery is a classic example. It's a type of fishery that you'll never have enough quota for every single quota holder in that fishery. I think there's 6 in the fishery now. To ever justify owning a vessel. And we don't necessarily want 6 vessels because of effort and so forth. And we'd rather in that sector want, as is the case now, 2 vessel owners and you've got the other quota holders either utilizing the vessel in terms of a joint venture arrangement or because of investment in the vessel as part of an economic unit. But, and whereas in horse mackerel, you've got a very different scenario where you've got a dominant quota holder and essentially everybody else being a paper quota holder because they have no say over how that fish is caught, when it's caught, how it's marketed, at what price, etc. So you have a similar factual scenario in those 2 fisheries, but hardly, I think, justifiable to say that the non-vessel owners in both those fisheries are paper quotas. So it does require an understanding of the economic and fishing dynamic of each sector to understand and to be able to say you're a paper quota or you're not a paper quota holder.
Yeah, because it's and then you touched on it. I wanted to chat about that minimum viable quota, the MVQ, and it is a concept that is probably very difficult to calculate. Like you can't say, I saw someone on your Twitter timeline, someone said 2,000 tons of deep sea would be enough. But I mean, like you're saying, Daya Island that has less than 1,000 is running a business on such a small quota.
Yeah, we've always debated this thing. And of course, you've got to be able to set it at something. But, the concept of trying to come up with what is called a minimum viable quota, I mean, it's a moving target. I've never subscribed to the point of view to that point of view. And no one has ever been able to say to me definitively that for a specific sector, this is the economic basis for saying one needs a minimum of, because again, of the very individual and subjective nature of how every rand earned can be spent.
Yeah. And so one of the other topics I also wanted to touch on, and I wanted purely for educational purposes, is we've got a FRAP process that happens and the rights get allocated to the successful applicants. But I just want you to just give us like some guidance on how does the appeal process work. So you get your rights, and then of course there must be this appeal process in terms of the legislation. But then after the appeal process, you get the review process, and then and I see with the 8-inch trawl now we have review. So can you maybe just give us like a snapshot on just the appeal process, and when does reviews actually end? Is there ever an end game? Because everybody, I understand in the 8-inch people got, and then they said no, but you don't get any more. What's the recourse there?
Yeah. Okay. So just broadly, of course, rights are allocated under Section 18 of the Marine Resources Act. And whether you're successful or not, regardless, if you are unhappy with any aspect of that decision, and that decision is and has always been taken in terms of authority delegated by the minister. So the minister is essentially charged by Parliament under 18 to take decisions. But of course, as we know, everyone in the fishing industry knows, the minister delegates that authority to normally the DDG. In my day, we used to always spread that burden, because it also not only spreads the administrative burden on the DDG, but it also reduces risk and, of course, increases accountability and spreads that accountability amongst different officials. And, of course, we, especially in 2005, if you look at who were the decision makers were generally the experts in that sector. So, for example, in rock lobster, the decisions were taken by Dr. Andy Cocroft, who's the unquestionable expert on rock lobster. Chris Wilkie, for example, took the decisions in the traditional line fishery, because, of course, nobody knows lionfish better than Chris. So in those days, we ensured that the decisions were taken by people not only whose integrity was unquestionable, but who had the necessary expertise to substantiate and validate those decisions. And I guess for those reasons, not a single one of the decisions I was ever directly involved in has ever been overturned on review. So returning to the subject. So rights are allocated by a delegated authority. Whether you granted a right or not, but if you're unhappy with any aspect of it, you have the right to appeal that decision under Section 80 of the MLRA. And you can raise any matter on appeal. And you can raise any evidence on appeal, which the minister must take into consideration, provided, of course, that evidence and information, documents, ownership in vessels, etc., whatever you're wanting to raise to bolster your case, does not arise or did not arise after the date on which applications were due. So in essence, you can't recreate your application. You can't take a second bite at the proverbial cherry. The appellate authority is always the minister under law. So the minister has to decide the appeal under 80 of the MLRA. And of course, if you're unhappy with the minister's decision, she or he, well, it's obviously now it's Barbara Creasy, she will be the final administrative authority to take the decision. There's no one above the minister you can further appeal to. And so the law provides for review of those decisions should a reviewable case arise. And those reviews are undertaken under our law and is guided by the Promotion of Admin Justice Act, or PAJA. And in terms of PAJA, you have a maximum of 180 days from the date on which the decision was made or the date on which you should have been reasonably expected to know of the decision. You've got 180 days from there to take that decision on review. Of course, if the 180th day has passed and 190 or 200 days come, you can still launch a review application, but you'll have a further hurdle to overcome, and that is you'll have to first ask the court to condone your late application. And there are rules, and PAJA sets out the basis on which you can seek condonation. But it just makes your ability to exercise those review rights a little bit harder. You have an extra obstacle to overcome.
Okay, and
that's
so
that's about the legal process there. Yes.
Yeah. So and then so where are we? So we, of course, 2015 we had right allocations, and then there was the hake, inshore, and sole sector. I understand that they are still up in court. So where are we? Are we still in the review phase? What happened to those rights holders that had rights and they were told by the High Court, okay, but you don't have rights anymore?
Yeah, well, the hake, inshore, trawl fishery really does perhaps epitomize bad decision making. the nth level, I guess. So the DDG took the decision to allocate rights in December 2016. Those rights were allocated, and then a very fascinating series of litigations followed that. So the first up was, if I recall, I was then at that point in time charged with advising Sipakazi and Dudani, the DDG at the time, with the allocations. I recall I was on holiday when we got news that Viking Fishing had decided to launch an urgent review application, and they initially got the interdict to suspend the enforcement of her decision. They subsequently lost the review application, and so that Sipakazi's decision stood. There then was an appeals procedure, and the minister decided those appeals, and that resulted in a number of reviews, which were each of them were successful. So a couple of right holders reviewed the decision of the minister to exclude them, and that succeeded. But in the interim, there were subsequent other review applications being launched, both by successful quota holders seeking to review decisions on quota allocations. There was one, if I recall correctly, Letap Fishing, which challenged the decision with regard to the amount of quota they were allocated and then reduced. And then there was the big challenge by Sivuna, which essentially was, I guess, the principal catalyst for the what I understood was an unnecessary hiatus and confusion in the industry. So that order, the Sivuna order, which was taken on the 9th of August of 2018, of 2019, was essentially to set aside the decisions of the minister taken in December 2018. So the status quo ante as at July 2018 was to apply. It was very confusing, as to who got rights and who didn't get rights, and who lost rights and whose rights remained and at what levels. But the long and the short is that we're now at a process where 4 years after the allocation of rights, the appeals process has still to be concluded, which of course has to be an unacceptable set of events. It just shows the incredibly inefficient and unnecessary bureaucratic processes that have endured over this period. Essentially, a fifth of the entire rights allocation process has passed without this fishery having been settled. You can't possibly manage a fishery in this way. Right holders, a fifth of the way into the rights duration, can't conceivably be expected to have fully invested, created jobs, because nobody knows what's going to happen. Everyone's quota is still up for grabs, as it were. Nothing's been fixed. So it just creates confusion and once again, just another hindrance to investment in jobs or infrastructure and assets, etc.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that, Shaheen. The other thing I wanted to chat about is just a bit about, I see you also quite involved in the small-scale fishing sector. Of course, the whole of South Africa has got their 15-year rights. The small-scale sector, Western Cape is now up for grabs. So where are we with the small-scale sector? And I just wanted to touch or just tap into your brain a bit about the co-ops. I'm not too heavily involved in co-ops, and I just wanted to find out that was one of the prerequisites to get rights for 15 years. Are co-ops working? I really have I've got no facts around the co-ops.
Yeah, so of course, it's one of my bugbears about the mismanagement of our fishing system. And firstly, small scale commercial has always existed in South Africa, at least from 2001, when the July 17th Gazette of that year formally recognized what would be called limited and full commercial. So in a number of sectors, we had limited commercial fishing, like lobster, which would essentially be small-scale artisanal fishing. And of course, in 2005, of the 3,900 fishing rights allocated, 2,200 were allocated. 2,222, to be exact, were allocated to small-scale. And if one goes back to the 2005 General Fisheries Policy, our entire system of management was to ensure the complete protection and isolation of small-scale fishing from the intrusion of industrial fishing, whether through industrial fishing companies, their directors, or their shareholders. So we created an almost complete buffer around what was to be called the Cluster D and Cluster C fishery sectors, which were the small-scale fishing sectors. And what we see later on, especially with the adoption of the small-scale fishing policy, was that there was this miraculous rewriting of history, as if small-scale had never existed ever in the history of South African fisheries. And we've heard minister after minister speaking about how this is the first time ever small-scale is recognized, which is complete nonsense and has just added to the confusion. But essentially, the catastrophic consequences, I believe, of the adoption of the most ill-advised fishing policy, being the small-scale fisheries policy, has been to popularize, for want of a better term, this concept that everyone can benefit by being allocated fishing rights through cooperatives. But essentially what it is that no matter how populist or intent you are on rewriting history, there is only so much fish available for small-scale fishing, i.e. there's only so much fish in the nearshore fishing zones which can be accessed by small-scale fishermen with small boats that's available. And that's been always fully allocated, whether it's been to small-scale lobster fishermen, small-scale abalone, oyster, mussels, hake handliners, etc. So all that the small-scale fishery promised was the possibility of poverty and paper quotas, because all that they could do was take one quota, which was allocated to Joe Soap in a small-scale fishing community in, say, Doringbai, and take Joe's 800 kilos of lobster and allocate that same 800 kilos to 50 what would be called small-scale fishermen plucked out of that community. So all you're doing is you're taking 800 kilos that was allocated to one person, and that 800 kilos meant a viable economic livelihood for that one person, who then employed 4 other people. And now you've taken, in true socialist tradition, 800 kilos and spread the poverty equally amongst even more people. And that's what the small-scale fishing policy is. And of course, people will ooh and ah and say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, I've always said, tell me, is the small-scale fishing community of any village along our coast, Doringbai, Horniclip Bay, Port Nolloth, are they better off today than they were in 2006 or 2005? And the stats show unemployment is up, poverty levels are up, conflict is up, resource destruction is up. So nothing is actually better off. But what we have done is we've been able to stand on soapboxes and dish out and throw out to the masses below us all these paper quotas, which are worthless. So we've seen in the Northern Cape with the cooperatives there in Port Nolloth and in Honeycliffe Bay, those are essentially collapsed cooperatives because they can't function. Their management boards are regularly changed and uprooted, and because you can only do so much with so much quota that you've been allocated. There's 39 tons there, which is worth an absolute fortune if it was properly managed and allocated. But when you've allocated it to thousands and thousands of members of communities, it's worthless. And all you do is you create intra-community conflict. You put increased pressure on fishermen to overfish and poach because 39 tons has to feed now so many more people. And of course, well, the nature of the cooperative is typical of any system where accountability is non-existent. So who fishes, who markets, who processes, who has to transport the a lobster from the vessel to the factory, who carries those costs, who's got to pay for the fuel, who's got to pay for the bait. So those are all things that practically have never been thought through and have led to conflict. So we just have seen in Port Nolloth, for example, a complete collapse of the cooperative, and they've regularly tried now to just sell it off to the highest bidder. So they've just become a cooperative of paper quotas. And they just wanting to sell the quota off every year and get a check, and goodness knows what's happened to that. Even before the formal adoption of these, the department's flagship cooperative project in Doring Bay was an absolute failure. I've documented it extensively on my blog. I mean, a monumental failure. But of course, as is in typical tradition of our government, is that where there's failure, they seem to thrive and replicate. So instead of learning from the mistakes of the Doring Bay cooperative, and in fact every other cooperative before that, in my time when I started at Fisheries, we had just seen the complete collapse of SACFC, the South African Commercial Fishers Cooperative. 3,000 fishermen were left destitute thereby because of corruption and maladministration. But we don't learn. So what we do is we end up replicating failure in the name of populism. So unfortunately, as we've seen in the Eastern Cape with Barbara Creasy handing out, as she said, thousands of quotas to thousands of fishermen, those are worthless quotas. None of those fishermen in those cooperatives are able to afford a 10 million rand squid boat to go and catch squid, but they've got squid rights. They've been allocated hake handline rights. There's no hake in the near shore in the Eastern Cape waters anymore. The hake handline fish is pretty much dead. So you're handing out, again from your soapbox, thousands of rights, which you can perhaps tick box on an Excel spreadsheet, but they're worthless and they're meaningless. And all they do is they lead to thriving middlemen who manipulate poor fishermen in coastal villages. And in the Eastern Cape in particular, all the money goes to the chiefs. The chiefs pay those poor fishermen 5 rand a lobster, whereas they're getting 70, 80 rand in their pockets. We have these problems in the small-scale fishing sector, which are just, glossed over, and then we wonder why we've got less and less fish. Poaching is up, but people are poorer, and that's the reason, because we've adopted very, very bad policy.
Yeah, and I also saw that I think last year they also had a FRAP 2020. There was a gazette out that they're going to split some of the resources. I think it was squid that will be 25-75, handline 50-50. I mean, is that similar to the cooperative type of arrangement then? Now, what do those small scale fishers also then get?
Yeah, well, that entire concept was mooted on the basis that you would, in some bizarre parallel world, split small-scale fisheries between Peter and Paul. So essentially, those splits that you're talking of, except squid, of course, but in hake handline and lionfish, was essentially to split it between small-scale fishermen and cooperatives. So essentially, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and that's what I've been saying, is that the small-scale policy is simply all about spreading poverty. That's what it is. It's not about empowerment. It's not about bettering management of the resource or anything of the sort. It's simply the spreading of poverty through the farcical and mythical concept of increasing access to fish resources. I've always said, where are you getting, if you're increasing the number of right holders in the small-scale fishery, as the department has been repeatedly proud to admit that they're going to now allocate, I don't know, something like another 30,000 people or 10,000 people. Nobody really knows this number of additional people getting rights in the small-scale sectors. So if it's 10,000 or is it 30,000 people, my question is always, where is the extra fish coming from? Is the ANC government able to magically wave a wand and increase biomass 5-fold, 10-fold, 20-fold to accommodate these people? And of course, the answer is no. So the only logical conclusion is, if there are 10 tons of fish in the nearshore for fishing, whether it's oysters, mussels, hake, whatever it is, how do you take 10 tons, which was harvested? It wasn't not allocated. It was always fully allocated to 5 people. How do you take the 10 tons that was allocated and being fished by 5 people, and now you say that same 10 tons, and sorry, it's not the same 10 tons because every year it's getting less. Lobster is collapsed, abalone is collapsed, lionfishes are under pressure, etc. So how do you take less and less and now allocate it to not 5 people, but to 500 people? Well, the only logical conclusion is you're increasing poverty.
Yeah. Yeah, and then also, if we just touch on FRAP 2020 quickly, I mean, in a previous conversation, last week's interview, we touched on it a bit. What's your view on new entrants for 2020? I mean, what do you tell new entrants? Is there space for you? Is there resource available for you? What do you tell them?
Well, you don't tell them anything. No, I mean, the reality is, again, we have to do a careful analysis sector by sector. You know, we did that in 2004, 2003. You know, we started planning for the 2005 allocation process in 2002. Wow. Exactly. Because to write policy and to allocate rights requires a substantial amount of data and understanding of the socioeconomic and biological aspects of each fishing sector. It requires an innate knowledge, and no one person has that. So what is required is a comprehensive understanding of every fishing sector and where new entrants can or can't be accommodated, and where and under what conditions. Because of course, right holders have in law a legitimate expectation to be reallocated their rights, of course, if they've invested and transformed and committed to the objectives set forth in those 2005 policy objectives. And because of historic mismanagement of each fishing sector since 2005, there has never been a performance review which is mandated under every one of those sector policies. Never. So although there was one in theory in 2009, it was so badly managed that none of that data is relevant. In fact, the department admitted shortly after they published their own data, the data was so badly interpreted and managed that it was worthless. I mean, anyone looking at the data which was published, can easily see how ridiculously bad the data is. So there's never been there's never been a performance management and regular performance management of any fishing sector since 2005. So essentially, there's a 15-year data gap with each of these rights, that are up for allocation. Because again, even though there's rights being allocated from 2013, there's never been any data analysis of those fisheries either. So we still, so there's a huge data void for these fisheries. So whether a new entrant can be accommodated requires substantial amounts of understanding of the sector itself. And that, unfortunately, I know, having been involved in the department intimately, fairly recently, and given, of course, the subsequent, removal of a number of experts and people leaving the department, makes things only worse, because there's even less institutional knowledge and capacity to understand each fishing sector. So, you need to understand in a particular fishing sector, like Hague deep sea trawl, how does it operate? Who operates in what economic unit and joint venture? To what extent is that involvement? Who is capable of being replaced as existing right holders? How many new entrants could be accommodated? All those things require prior understanding, because you need to write policy for those eventualities. You need policy, and you need criteria, and you need rules to empower a decision maker, because a decision maker can only do things in terms of the four corners of the rules and requirements set forth in those policies. So, that was the big hindrance which Sipakazi found herself in, and difficulty in 2016, is because she had such generic policy documents, very little criteria. There was very little she could do to effectively restructure, empower, transform. And so because of generic policy and bad policy development. So you need to really understand every single sector and ensure that every single sector is carefully crafted and governed by specific policy and criteria, because while there may be scope for a new entrant or 10 new entrants or 100 new entrants in one sector, it could be scope for very little to no new entrants in another sector. And it's not hard to look at where there could very well be scope for new entrants, what numbers could be accommodated, but you require innate understanding of each fishery and who's performed and to what extent they've performed. The prior knowledge and data is critical to understanding that, because then you'll be able to write policy knowing who would possibly be the applicants who fall out, i.e. the ones that have not invested in jobs, in vessels or in factories or in anything, people who are the proper paper quotas, for example, Hague Longline. You need to understand beforehand who's just taken the money and run for the last 15 years, or the same in any other sector. Those are people that surely do not deserve a second go at 15-year rights without having spent a cent creating jobs, investing in infrastructure, etc. And there you could, in those circumstances, justify giving it to someone else to have a go at it.
Yeah, and then the other one, the last topic is probably just twofold of a question. In your policy, there's quite your policy, the 2005 policy. There's quite a few pages on transformation, and I mean, it just goes on. And transformation is always such a big thing. Every FLAP process, we just speak about transformation. If you look at that policy of 2005, and you look where we are 15 years later, do you think what has happened has reached those goals or that mind that you had regarding the transformation, and where to with FLAP 2020 and transformation?
Yeah, the problem is that South Africa has become this complete race-obsessed country, where transformation is no longer anything positive or meaningful. It's simply a case of, determining how black someone is, a company, a sector, and that is destructive, because that in itself is the engine to drive fronting and paper quotas, because it's destructive in nature. Transformation ought to be something very positive, which not only results in the empowerment of people, whether historically marginalized or denied political or social equality, but it must also mean transformation for the betterment of the resource, of community, of province, of regions. And the problem is that we've lost sight of that. And so, as we've seen, is that these rights allocation processes literally become a race to how black you are. And I see it now as people are positioning themselves, looking for young, black, disabled females, because that's going to score you the most points. So you literally have a race on to find the most willing under 36-year-old black female who's preferably disabled. I mean, it's absolutely sickening that this is what we've become. I mean, Verwoerd will be smiling as to how completely we've adopted his philosophy of race definition and acceptance. So that is the real tragedy. I don't foresee that changing at all, and I don't think anybody in their right minds foresees that changing, because, well, that is this government's commitment is race nationalization of pretty much everything. And that, unfortunately, in my view, will only result in mass fronting, unsubstantive transformation. And again, we'll see another rights allocation process simply allocating rights to probably the most politically connected, the most black, the most female, but without necessarily engaging in any further substantive transformation of any fishing sector. Like I said, we had the opportunity to transform the horse mackerel fishing sector. And that isn't just a case of making it more black, but leveling the fields, changing its structure, allowing smaller vessels to operate in the fishery as opposed to a single large factory trawler. That's all transformation. And the same opportunities, unfortunately, will be missed because of this race obsession of transformation when it comes to allocating rights in the Hague deep sea trawl fishery. There's so many transformative and empowering opportunities in that fishery that could be achieved. Similarly, in South Coast rock lobster, a small fishery, but there's so many transformative opportunities there in terms of how fish is caught by who, how it's marketed, where it's marketed, how it's processed. Small pelagics as well. It's both a pilchard and an anchovy fishery, and we know pilchards are a fishery on its knees now with the zero TAC again. Squid as well. Huge opportunities for substantive transformation. But if we remain completely invested in simply allocating rights to the most black only, or substantially, then we will continue to lose our way and see the decimation of fisheries, because it can't just be about race. It has to be about the cumulative values of empowerment and transformation.
And then lastly, Shaheen, there's just this one definition in my head that I'm trying to get around is, what's your, or not your definition, or what's your view on the definition of the brother and sister relationship in terms of fishing rights? Well, I mean, if you just had to break it down for us, what would that mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I was flabbergasted with. I mean, again, it's a concept that was used for the first time in 2016 and then used across almost every fishing sector, again, because of copy and paste and generic policy. objectives. And again, it's not useful. The nature of the South African fishing industry is our fisheries exist in a global fisheries market, and within that we are minuscule. We're non-existent. We're producing less than a million tons less than $1 billion worth of fish a year. I mean, Vietnam produces more prawns in its aquaculture facilities than we do. I mean, if you just look at comparative production values, it's embarrassing. Anyway, so we need to again look at it both within the more global and then within the local economic perspective. And what we should be doing, as opposed to denying, which was the case again in 2016, was encouraging successful existing right holders to diversify across many more sectors. But what we do is we view in a typically, again, centralist, socialist controlling method that we need to control and regulate how many rights a company should have. What we should be doing is saying, if you're successful, especially in the employment and investment sectors of a sector, then please we're going to give you another opportunity in another sector or in another 2 sectors to replicate that success. Because surely as a country, our objective must be around increasing investments in local economies and creating jobs, and of course, responsibly managing our fisheries, as opposed to allocating smaller and smaller and smaller amount of quotas to more and more people. Again, that is not even in line with Chapter 6 of the National Development Plan, which specifically says stop allocating smaller and smaller quotas to more and more people. So this brother-sister thing is, I think, ill-advised. What we do need is to ensure and encourage right holders to stop cherry picking and stop making multiple applications. And they're only doing that because of policy uncertainty and lack of clarity around the rules of engagement. So if we craft proper, clear, unambiguous policy around who we're wanting to allocate rights to and who we won't be allocating rights to, then you'll reduce the chance applications, because that's what it is. It's about right holders scared of losing quota because of the department's clear ambivalence towards successful and growing large corporate companies in the fishing sector. And that's what we want. We want people who are successful, who grow, who invest in more and more jobs, and investment in vessels, etc., as opposed to hundreds of non-investing, non-job creating paper quota holders who simply proliferate in the industry.
Mr. Moola, I think we could probably carry on for another hour, but I mean, it's so interesting, and I think there are a lot of other aspects that we could touch on, but I think we're moving to an hour already, because it's really interesting to get insight into how the processes of the fishing industry in South Africa work, especially this rights application process. It's just so, it's very interesting for me to understand all the different angles of how the rights are issued. But I mean, from my side, Shaheen, thank you so much. I mean, it's really valuable. It's the whole hour. And I just wanted to ask you, where do people get hold of you? I mean, I know you have a blog, and for interest's sake, where does the name come from? Feike, is it Feike?
Feike.
Feike, where does the name come from?
So those are the historic Khoisan fish traps, which are the Feike of Stilbaai. So they date back 3,000 years old. 3,000 years. And yeah, so if you go to our website, you'll see a picture of the Feike. And we just adapted the spelling for the company name because, of course, a Feike is a clever fisheries management solution. It's a fish trap. We hope we provide clever fishery management solutions.
Shaheen, yeah, and I mean, of course, everybody can get hold of your Twitter as well. So entertaining timeline. But what's in Shaheen's plan going forward? What's the bigger picture?
Well, we provide quite a bit of advice to our clients in the now very struggling whale watching sector, the shark cage diving sector, and of course, we'll continue to provide advice to right holders and prospective right holders in the commercial fishing sector. We still have unfinished business in the line fishing sector, where we've been providing pro bono advice and litigation advice to the KZN fishers. We recently were told that the minister is considering an out-of-court settlement in that litigation, which we launched for the KZN fishermen to continue night fishing in certain MPAs. And so we believe the minister will accede to a settlement agreement. And yeah, we have a couple of other litigation matters that we're still needing to close, which we'll be pursuing. But yeah, we remain committed to providing advice to members of the fishing industry, both here and abroad.
Yeah, interesting stuff happening at our neighbors in Namibia. Very, very interesting.
Ill-advised and desperate fire sale of public fishing rights. For supposedly to earn money for PPE. I mean, Namibia, I think, have had 19 COVID deaths. Hardly something to start selling your crown jewels for.
Yeah, so true. But anyway, thank you so much for your time. I mean, I really appreciate it. Anything else from you? Thanks.
Excellent. No, thanks, Miles.
Okay, we'll chat again. Thanks, Shane.
Cheers.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye.
Yeah, guys, so there you have it, Shaheen Moola. Go over to his blog. It's very, very interesting. Follow him on Twitter. He's also got a very interesting timeline. And for those of you that joined, thanks for joining. Thanks for the questions as well. I did touch on some of the questions in the interview. Until next time, let's introduce by Monday or Tuesday. I'll be able to tell you who my next guest is. But until next time, thank you for joining, and goodbye.